What if the rise and fall of entire nations were not random events, but predictable stages in a repeating cycle that modern governments refuse to acknowledge? When you look closely at the six-stage financial cycle that has shaped empires for thousands of years, something unsettling becomes clear. The modern world is not inventing anything new. It is simply reliving what every dominant civilization eventually faced. And once you identify the patterns, once you see the hidden signals embedded in currency expansion, asset bubbles, national debt behavior, and geopolitical ambition, it becomes almost impossible to unsee where the global economy is heading next. Suddenly, countries like Korea, Poland, and India stop looking like isolated success stories and start resembling early-stage versions of economic powers that eventually hit the same structural walls. This idea challenges our sense of control. We like to believe that better technology, stronger institutions, and faster communication can protect nations from repeating old financial mistakes. But history suggests the opposite. Every cycle begins the same way: optimism, rapid growth, foreign investment, booming productivity. Then comes the quiet shift that only a few analysts notice, when expansion becomes dependency and risk becomes institutionalized. The first two stages of the cycle are always seductive, because everything still looks stable on the surface. Yet beneath the surface, the foundation is already changing. You start noticing similar patterns in emerging economies today: a surge of capital inflows, credit expansion masked as development, and governments celebrating indicators that historically signaled the beginning of a dangerous trajectory. You have probably seen this pattern before without realizing it. So let me ask you directly, have you ever felt that modern financial news sounds strangely similar to past crises, as if the world were repeating the same script with new actors? If this resonates with you, stay with me, because what comes next can reshape the way you interpret global stability. The six-stage cycle is not just an academic model. It is a map of repeated human behavior, political incentives, and predictable economic turning points. And the more you understand it, the harder it becomes to trust the optimistic narratives that dominate headlines. Before we dig deeper, tell me in the comments if you have ever sensed that the global economy is moving in circles rather than progressing. Your perspective matters here. And while you're at it, make sure to like this video and check if you are already subscribed, because what you will discover next might change how you see the world. Let us continue. The deeper you move into the mechanics of historical financial cycles, the more you realize that these patterns did not appear randomly. They emerge from a consistent sequence of human choices shaped by ambition, fear, expansion, and scarcity. The six-stage model is not a modern invention, but the distillation of centuries of repeated economic behavior. Empires, kingdoms, republics, and now nation-states all began by exploiting a moment of opportunity, often triggered by demographic growth, resource access, or foreign capital seeking higher returns. This early stage always feels like a new beginning, but the foundations of the cycle were set long before anyone recognized the signs. What makes this pattern so persistent is that the incentives driving leaders seldom change. When a country begins its ascent, optimism blinds decision-making. Productivity rises, new industries appear, and governments take credit for a trend that usually starts with external forces rather than internal genius. Over time, scholars notice that these early accelerations follow almost identical trajectories across civilizations. A young economy opens its markets, attracts investment, and becomes a magnet for global liquidity seeking higher yields. But behind the celebration lies a crucial detail. This growth rarely comes from internal strength alone. It is propelled by dependence on foreign capital, imported technology, and external demand. The cycle quietly locks the nation into a structure where prosperity becomes conditional on maintaining a fragile balance between expansion and vulnerability. History shows that when this balance shifts, even slightly, the entire trajectory of the nation shifts with it. What fascinates researchers is that leaders rarely see this process happening in real time. They assume stability will last indefinitely. They believe rising indicators confirm their policies. They misinterpret temporary booms as permanent transformations. And because the early stages create a sense of national pride, citizens reinforce the illusion of control. This is exactly why the model repeats itself so reliably. Human behavior stays the same, even as the world modernizes. Ambition accelerates growth. Growth attracts capital. Capital raises expectations. Expectations push institutions toward decisions that favor short-term gains over long-term resilience. By the time economists start to notice distortions, the country is already advancing through the cycle faster than anyone predicted. Every nation that reached later stages began here, wrapped in the same optimism, following the same upward curve that masked the structural weaknesses forming underneath. And once you recognize these roots, the next step of the cycle becomes unavoidable. As the cycle progresses, nations slip into stage 1 almost without noticing because it never begins with crisis. It begins with comfort. Indicators still look healthy. Credit is accessible. Foreign capital continues to flow in, reinforcing the belief that growth is natural and sustainable. But stage 1 has a hidden mechanism that history repeatedly exposes. During this phase, governments and institutions begin relying on expansionary policies that were originally meant to be temporary. Incentives shift subtly. Political leaders discover that maintaining rapid growth buys them approval, stability, and international prestige. So they double down, often without realizing they are setting the conditions for structural imbalance. The first stage always feels like a reward, but it is actually the formation of a dependency that becomes difficult to reverse. In young economies, stage 1 typically emerges when investment outpaces real productivity. Infrastructure grows, urban centers expand, and the nation begins to attract attention as a rising star. Yet beneath the excitement lies the early distortion of the cycle. Consumption grows faster than production. Credit grows faster than wages. Imports rise faster than domestic capability. And because the world views the country as a promising market, global investors continue pouring money into sectors that later become fragile. This moment is dangerous precisely because nothing looks dangerous. It feels like momentum. But history shows it is the calm before the pivot point. Politicians encourage the illusion further. They associate rapid gains with innovation, leadership, or national destiny, when in reality the pattern mirrors almost every major economic ascent of the past. Rome, Britain, the Dutch Republic, the United States in its early expansions, Japan before the asset bubble, and countless modern emerging economies all displayed the same early signatures. Rising credit availability leads to cultural optimism. Optimism leads to risk tolerance. Risk tolerance leads to institutional overconfidence. By the time analysts begin questioning the sustainability of this growth, public sentiment has already anchored itself around the idea that progress is permanent. This psychological shift is the true marker of stage 1. It is not defined by numbers on a chart, but by belief. Once a nation convinces itself that it has mastered prosperity, the cycle accelerates automatically. Citizens increase spending. Banks increase lending. Governments increase commitments. And the entire machine moves forward under the assumption that its trajectory is stable. This is why stage 1 transitions so easily into stage 2. The system becomes conditioned to expansion, leaving little room for restraint. Everything that follows begins here, quietly, under the surface, long before anyone realizes the cycle has already taken hold. As the financial cycle shifts from stage 1 into stage 2, the transformation is subtle yet unmistakable for those who know where to look. This is the moment when optimism becomes strategy, and strategy becomes doctrine. The nation enters a phase where external validation fuels internal confidence, and this confidence leads policymakers to formalize behaviors that were once temporary responses to rapid growth. Stage 2 is the point where expansion stops feeling like a phase and starts feeling like identity. It is also where the cycle becomes self-reinforcing, because the appearance of prosperity convinces both leaders and citizens that the trajectory is now guaranteed. In this stage, something important happens beneath the surface. The economy begins to depend on continuous inflows of capital to sustain the pace it has set for itself. At first, no one questions it. Rising markets, ambitious construction, expanding credit, and growing consumer demand all seem like logical progressions. But when you examine the underlying structure, you begin to see the early rigidity forming. The nation becomes more vulnerable to shifts in global liquidity, to foreign investors adjusting their risk appetite, and to geopolitical pressures that influence trade and interest rates. Yet the public narrative grows even more confident. Governments celebrate record highs, companies expand aggressively, and households take on obligations under the assumption that the upward curve will continue. This is exactly why countries like Korea, Poland, and India stand out today. Their rapid development, technological leaps, expanding middle classes, and increasing global relevance mirror the same second stage that past rising powers experienced. They are not at risk because they are weak. They are at risk because they are strong, in a way that history shows is temporary. Their infrastructure booms, credit cycles, and high growth metrics signal not a destination, but a transition. And while these nations present themselves as models of modern resilience, the pattern suggests they are stepping into the same phase that countless economies entered before advancing into the next, more unstable stages. The most revealing indicator of stage 2 is confidence turning into expectation. Economies begin planning future budgets based on growth that has not yet occurred. Corporations invest based on projections that assume no interruption. Families borrow based on income that feels secure but is increasingly tied to external conditions. The entire system becomes synchronized around momentum. And once a country reaches this psychological threshold, the next steps in the cycle unfold with remarkable consistency, even if no one is consciously aware that the transition has already begun. Before we continue, share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe nations like Korea, Poland, and India fit this stage, or do you see their trajectory differently? Your perspective adds value to the analysis and helps expand the conversation. Let us move forward. As the cycle evolves towards stage 3, the shifts become more structural and less visible on the surface. This is the stage where the foundations laid in earlier phases begin transforming into long-term commitments that reshape the nation's economic DNA. The patterns that once looked like signs of strength now begin to reveal the early symptoms of imbalance. Credit expansion intensifies, not because it is needed for growth, but because the system has grown accustomed to relying on it. Productivity gains slow, but investment continues rising as institutions attempt to sustain the momentum created during the earlier boom. This widening gap between real output and financial activity is one of the clearest indicators that the cycle is moving into deeper territory. What makes this stage so complex is the illusion of stability. Asset prices continue climbing, consumers maintain confidence, and governments report metrics that appear reassuring. Yet underneath, the nation begins shifting from organic growth to leveraged growth. Historical cycles show this transition repeatedly. Empires, industrial giants, and modern economies all reached a point where their internal engines of expansion weakened, forcing them to depend on financial engineering, external funding, or speculative capital to keep advancing. This shift does not feel like decline at first. It feels like acceleration. The numbers can even appear stronger than before, which is why leaders often interpret this period as validation of their earlier decisions. But the engine is changing. Industries that once drove productivity begin to slow as competition increases, technology matures, or labor costs rise. Instead of adapting, institutions replicate the behaviors that worked in the early stages. They expand credit, extend subsidies, or encourage risk-taking. Meanwhile, investors chase returns in sectors that inflate faster than fundamentals can justify. Real estate, technology, commodity speculation, and large-scale infrastructure projects often become magnets for capital during this stage, repeating the same pattern observed in dozens of historical cycles. The deeper movement of stage 3 is psychological as much as economic. A nation begins assuming that its new status in the global hierarchy is permanent. This belief reshapes how governments plan, how corporations invest, and how citizens spend. The country grows confident enough to take on long-term obligations, often underestimating how sensitive its success still is to global liquidity conditions. And because these commitments align with public enthusiasm, the momentum becomes difficult to slow down without triggering fear or political backlash. This is the stage where the distortions that will later define the crisis quietly take shape. Excess investment, overconfidence, financial leverage, and a widening gap between perception and reality become intertwined. Once these elements merge, the cycle gains a direction that becomes harder to reverse. And from here, everything points toward the next escalation. As the forces of stage 3 accumulate, the transition into stage 4 occurs almost imperceptibly, yet it marks one of the most consequential turning points in the entire financial cycle. This is the moment when momentum stops being an advantage and begins functioning as a trap. The systems built during the early expansion now require ever-increasing levels of support just to maintain their previous pace. Governments discover that their budgets depend on revenue projections tied to high growth. Corporations find themselves leveraged to expectations that no longer reflect current productivity. Banks carry layers of risk created during the earlier expansion, assuming stability will continue simply because it has so far. Stage 4 is where the cycle becomes heavy, where the structure begins demanding more than it can sustainably generate. Historical patterns show that nations rarely recognize the shift as it happens. Instead, they interpret the slowdown as a temporary inconvenience rather than a structural signal. To counteract the deceleration, policymakers often intensify interventions. Interest rates may be lowered artificially, credit conditions loosened, subsidies expanded, or large national projects launched to stimulate demand. These actions do create temporary boosts, but they also magnify the underlying imbalances. Growth becomes increasingly dependent on artificial stimuli rather than organic productivity. The nation begins living on borrowed time, using financial leverage to delay the consequences of structural fatigue. What makes stage 4 particularly deceptive is that surface-level indicators can still appear positive. Employment might remain stable, capital markets may hold their value, and households might continue spending as though nothing has changed. But deeper metrics tell a different story. Debt to GDP ratios climb faster than output. Corporate earnings plateau despite rising valuations. Government liabilities expand as revenue forecasts weaken. The economy becomes more reactive to external shocks, because its internal buffers have thinned. This is the stage in which past empires often overextended themselves, committing to military expansion, territorial control, or infrastructure megaprojects that strain their finances beyond recovery. Simultaneously, social expectations continue rising. Citizens accustomed to fast improvement resist any policy that implies restraint. Politicians, aware of these expectations, avoid difficult reforms. Instead, they lean further into the illusion of stability, reinforcing the cycle's trajectory. Meanwhile, global investors begin noticing inconsistencies. Capital inflows slow, risk premiums rise. The once celebrated economy enters a quieter, more fragile phase where confidence still holds, but the foundation beneath it is changing rapidly. Stage 4 is the point where structural reality catches up with ambition. The economy is still moving, still expanding in visible ways, but the core is weakening. Every decision made during this phase shapes what happens next, because once the system reaches this threshold, the next stage begins forming in the background long before anyone acknowledges it. The momentum that once propelled the nation upward now begins guiding it toward conditions that are far more difficult to reverse. As the trajectory of Stage 4 deepens, the pressures that have been building beneath the surface finally begin to reshape the entire structure of the economy, leading directly into Stage 5. This is where the cost of previous decisions becomes unavoidable. The nation enters a phase in which leverage, risk, and accumulated obligations start exerting real weight on institutions. Unlike earlier stages, where optimism and growth masked the weaknesses, Stage 5 exposes them. Debt servicing becomes harder. Investment returns weaken, productivity growth stalls, and the very tools that once amplified expansion now restrict flexibility. What looked like strength begins revealing itself as overextension. One of the most telling markers of Stage 5 is the silent erosion of wealth. Asset prices may still appear stable, but their connection to underlying fundamentals weakens. Real wages stagnate or decline when adjusted for inflation. Savings lose purchasing power, and sectors that were celebrated during the earlier boom show signs of fatigue. Governments face difficult choices as revenue growth slows while obligations rise. They often respond by increasing taxation, expanding money supply, or implementing policies meant to preserve social stability. These actions may delay visible decline, but they accelerate the hidden deterioration occurring underneath. At the same time, international perception shifts. Investors who once saw the nation as a rising star begin demanding higher returns to compensate for increased risk. Capital becomes more selective. Foreign creditors tighten conditions. Trade. Partners reconsider long-term commitments. These reactions are subtle at first, but history shows they play a critical role in pushing economies deeper into Stage 5. Reduced access to external liquidity makes it harder for governments and corporations to maintain the pace they once took for granted. And without the ability to rely on cheap capital, internal weaknesses become more exposed. The psychological shift of this stage is equally significant. Confidence does not collapse abruptly. Instead, it fades gradually as households notice that their standard of living no longer improves at the rate it once did. Companies begin scaling back expansion plans. Banks tighten lending standards. Even cultural narratives change, replacing national optimism with cautious pragmatism. This shift in sentiment is often the clearest signal that the cycle has entered its late phase, because the public mood begins aligning with the underlying economic reality. Despite these pressures, the system continues moving forward, but with increasing friction. Every adjustment becomes heavier. Every policy response yields smaller results. The cycle no longer feels like forward momentum, but like an effort to maintain balance on weakening ground. And as history shows, once a nation reaches this stage, the next transformation begins forming quietly in the background, preparing to reshape the entire economic landscape in ways few expect. Before we advance, share your thoughts in the comments. Do you recognize these patterns in modern economies, or do you think the cycle is shifting in new ways? Your insight adds depth to the discussion. Let us continue. As the cycle advances beyond the mounting pressures of Stage 5, the nation slips into Stage 6, the phase that history repeatedly identifies as the most transformative and the most misunderstood. This stage is not defined by a dramatic single moment, but by the gradual convergence of vulnerabilities accumulated over decades. The structural imbalances that once seemed manageable now interact with each other, amplifying their effects. Weak productivity growth combines with high debt burdens. Declining confidence merges with rising financial fragility. Political tensions intensify as governments struggle to reconcile public expectations with shrinking resources. What emerges is a climate in which even small disturbances can trigger significant consequences. The hallmark of this stage is the erosion of resilience. Institutions that once acted as stabilizing forces become increasingly reactive. Central banks face the dilemma of choosing between inflation and stagnation. Fiscal authorities confront obligations that exceed their capacity to fund them. Corporations attempt to restructure, but face shrinking markets and rising operational costs. As these pressures accumulate, the economy becomes less capable of absorbing shocks. Historical patterns show that this weakening does not always appear immediately in headline indicators. Unemployment may rise slowly, GDP growth may fluctuate rather than collapse, but beneath the surface, liquidity tightens, defaults increase, and credit channels begin to strain. This phase also brings a notable geopolitical dimension. Nations facing domestic fragility often turn outward, seeking external narratives to justify internal pressures. Some pursue aggressive foreign policy strategies to rally public support. Others attempt to attract foreign capital through concessions that weaken long-term sovereignty. Trade relationships become tense as partners lose confidence in the nation's ability to honor commitments. The interplay between economic fragility and geopolitical ambition has been observed repeatedly, from aging empires to modern economies experiencing the limits of prolonged expansion. The social fabric undergoes subtle but powerful shifts as well. Trust in institutions weakens. Public discourse becomes polarized. Citizens who once believed in continuous progress begin questioning the system itself. As living costs rise and opportunities become scarce, frustration grows. This transformation is one of the clearest indicators that the nation has crossed into the final stage of the cycle, because societal expectations no longer align with economic reality. This widening gap feeds discontent and destabilizes the sense of national direction. What makes Stage 6 particularly significant is that it sets the stage for the structural resets that follow. Whether the outcome is currency devaluation, political upheaval, institutional reform, or the rise of entirely new economic models, the seeds of transformation are planted here. The system is not collapsing arbitrarily. It is responding to decades of accumulated strain. And once the nation enters this phase, the path forward depends increasingly on how leaders and citizens navigate pressures that no longer respond to familiar tools or optimistic narratives. As the structural pressures of Stage 6 deepen, the nation enters a critical moment where its past choices begin shaping its future with overwhelming force. This is the stage where errors, once subtle, become amplified by the fragility of the system. The economy no longer has the buffers that once softened shocks. Instead, every imbalance interacts with another, creating a network of vulnerabilities that spreads across institutions, markets, and households. What makes this phase particularly revealing is how consistently nations repeat the same mistakes, even when historical examples provide clear warnings of what lies ahead. One of the most common errors is policy denial. Governments confronted with slowing growth often attempt to revive momentum using tools that worked decades earlier. They lower interest rates aggressively, inject liquidity, or subsidize industries that no longer generate sustainable returns. These measures sometimes produce short-term relief, but they distort market signals and delay necessary corrections. Investors, misled by artificial stability, re-enter markets under the impression that risks are contained. This creates brief cycles of optimism that fade quickly, leaving the underlying weaknesses even more visible. Another recurring mistake occurs in the corporate sector. Companies accustomed to easy credit and expanding markets struggle to adapt when conditions tighten. Some attempt to maintain their scale by taking on more debt, hoping that demand will recover. Others pivot towards speculative investments or untested ventures, seeking high returns to offset declining core performance. These strategies rarely succeed in late-cycle environments. Instead, they accelerate the erosion of capital, weaken balance sheets, and increase systemic exposure to defaults. The economy becomes increasingly sensitive to even minor disruptions, because the margin for error has nearly disappeared. Households are not immune to these pressures. As living costs rise and real wages stagnate, families rely more heavily on credit to maintain their standard of living. This shift, while understandable, reinforces the fragility of the broader system. When household debt grows faster than income, the nation enters a phase where consumer resilience weakens, and small financial shocks can trigger widespread strain. This vulnerability often emerges at the same time that confidence in institutions declines, creating a feedback loop where economic anxiety fuels political polarization, and political polarization further undermines economic stability. The final recurring mistake is strategic overreach. Nations in this phase sometimes expand their geopolitical ambitions in ways that exceed their capacity. Whether through military commitments, trade conflicts, or diplomatic gambles, these actions can intensify economic pressures rather than relieve them. History repeatedly shows that late-stage powers misinterpret temporary displays of strength as signs of enduring influence, only to discover that their internal conditions cannot support the direction they have chosen. These patterns do not emerge randomly. They reflect the psychological and structural traps embedded in every late-stage financial cycle. And once a nation sinks into these behaviors, the transition into the final phase becomes almost inevitable. What comes next is shaped not by ambition, but by the accumulated weight of the cycle itself. As the cycle reaches its final stage, the forces that shaped the nation's rise now determine the nature of its transformation. The accumulated weight of debt, expectations, political strain, and structural imbalance begins pushing the system toward a reset. This reset does not always announce itself through dramatic events. More often, it unfolds through gradual adjustments that reveal how deeply the previous stages reshaped the country's internal dynamics. Currency pressures intensify as confidence weakens. Institutions that once drove expansion begin restructuring as their old models fail to deliver the stability they once promised. The society, now aware of the tension between past promises and present realities, starts redefining what prosperity means in a world where familiar tools no longer work. In this phase, nations often confront their limits. The very mechanisms that fueled earlier growth, such as cheap credit, rapid expansion, and optimistic projections, become liabilities. Governments attempt to maintain control by adjusting policies that once felt unshakable. Central banks intervene more frequently, not to stimulate growth, but to prevent further deterioration. Corporations redefine their strategies around survival rather than scale, and households adapt to slower progress, rising uncertainty, and shifting financial conditions. The economy begins operating under new constraints, marking the quiet emergence of a different cycle beginning to form beneath the remnants of the old one. Yet this stage is not simply about decline. It is also an inflection point where the system prepares for reinvention. History shows that after every cycle ends, a new macrostructure eventually rises, built on the lessons that were previously ignored. Technologies advance, institutions evolve, new policies reshape the landscape. Some nations recover quickly, embracing reform and resilience. Others resist change and prolong the instability. But in every case, the final stage clears the ground for the next trajectory, reshuffling. Global power, redefining economic hierarchies, and altering the direction of the world economy. The question that matters is not whether the cycle ends, but what emerges after it resets. For you, who stayed with this exploration until the end, it is worth reflecting on how these stages help make sense of the world around us. If you reach this point, leave a comment saying I am with you until the end. It helps create a sense of continuity in this community and signals that you value content that digs deeper than headlines. And if the analysis made the global landscape feel more understandable, consider subscribing so you can follow the next discussions. A-Like also helps more people find this type of content. There is a video here on the side that connects with the ideas we explored and expands them even further. If you want to continue this journey of understanding how economic cycles shape the world, click and come with me. Let us keep going.